Good morning. I think it still is morning for 5 more minutes, and we have the tough gig because we have to talk to you about book and claim before lunch. So we promise we'll be very, we hope, a dynamic conversation, and we promise to get you out at 12:30. My name is Mark Breen. I'm CEO of Oneiros Aerospace, and we've worked with across 3 continents advising SAF producers, regulators, and academics on the evolution of SAF and the scale. And my current focus is understanding how we finance the transition to net zero, particularly through the scaling of SAF. This conversation is very timely, particularly as we're going to explore over the next 20 minutes, will corporates drive book and claim? What is book and claim? And how might they do it from an investor perspective? So I've got a great panel with me today, and I think this conversation is very timely. Obviously, corporate involvement in SAF is evolving rapidly from carbon offsetting skepticism to deeper participation in Scope 3 emissions reductions. But as book and claim gains traction, obviously the number of questions, how it will work, how it will scale, becomes increasingly complex if we let it, and obviously is a key enabler for decarbonisation. So we're gonna examine a few of those topics, understand what the current market is, understand where book and claim is, and then towards the end, what are the things we can do to understand that a little bit more, make the collective lives of everybody a little bit simpler, but also understand how this may evolve and ultimately what corporations will drive for the book and claim. So I'm joined by a great panelist, Patrick Edmond, who's Chief Marketing Officer at Future Energy Global, and Maxime Molenaar, I hope I pronounced it correctly. I probably didn't, representing SkyNRG. So we'll start off, and again, we'll welcome questions, and we'll open the floor towards the end as well. But we'll just start off by asking each of you just a little bit about your organizations, and in particular, what is book and claim from a corporate's perspective? Ladies first.
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. So SkyNRG is a sustainable aviation fuel company. We are working on developing projects for production, but we are also very active in the market for SAF and for book and claim right now. And we've been doing book and claim transactions for the past 10 plus years. I've been with the company for 6 years, and I'll tell you that within that 6 years, the market has completely changed from having no guidance whatsoever on how to do something like this to having maybe a little bit too many. So I'm very curious to see, what the market will bring over the next couple of years, and to be discussing the topic with you today. Did you want me to touch upon what it is as well? Or yeah, sure.
That's okay.
Very simply put, the fuel that we produce today, that sustainable aviation fuel has a couple of elements, right? It's the physical fuel, it's the energy content, but you also have the value of the carbon reduction. And that value can be transported along with the physical fuel, or it can be decoupled from the physical fuel. And that decoupling is basically book and claim. So you book the fuel, the physical fuel somewhere, you claim it elsewhere. And there's many parties claiming the benefits of that and also the downside of fossil fuel, right? So what I always ask people to kind of mentally do is, if you have a ton of fossil jet fuel, think about who would be reporting on the emissions of that jet fuel along the way. There's airlines, there's people sitting on the plane, there's people flying goods on the plane, there's airports, there's financiers. There are so many parties along the way that are reporting the emissions of fossil jet fuel. And those parties similarly have an interest in reducing those emissions and therefore driving SAF, therefore driving book and claim. And why we need that system is because it's incredibly inefficient to be transporting very small volumes of fuel all around the world to physical locations, right? So we need to create that efficiency as the market is growing, as the market is maturing.
Thank you. Patrick.
I think Maxime's explained the basis of book and claim really, really well. A couple of words of introduction from my side. I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Future Energy Global, which is a SAF demand aggregator. What do we mean by that? We see one of the big issues in scaling SAF as being the mismatch between what producers are looking for in terms of long-term offtakes and what airlines are able to deliver in terms of timescale over which they can place orders. So we believe there's a role for an intermediate layer of aggregation there, where we go out and we contract for offtakes with a range of different SAF producers, and we also contract with a range of airlines and corporates on the demand side to provide that market scaling capability. And back to book and claim, because that's our subject. A couple of things I'd add to Maxime's excellent explanation is, at times when people come to book and claim, thinking about book and claim for the first time, it seems a bit weird, this kind of decoupling things. The best example I can give, because this is very well established in other markets, example I can give is your household electricity bill. So imagine you see an advertisement from an electricity supplier offering you renewable electricity produced using wind and solar. You can sign up, you can switch to a new supplier, and your electricity will be wind and solar. So you do that, you switch. That doesn't mean all of a sudden that the electrons coming out of the plug socket in your house are now green because they've come directly from a solar farm. It means, and intuitively I think we all get this, it means that the supplier has essentially added up what the demand is that it needs to meet and has gone out and acquired the appropriate environmental attributes from renewable electricity to match that. So that's what book and claim means in this case, and we're simply applying a very well-established mechanism to the SAF industry.
And we might build that up as we go through our conversation, but there are many different facets to it, and it can become very complex very quickly. So let's take it step by step, if we like, and so that from an investor perspective, we're clear on what they're getting and what the addressable market is and how that's going to evolve and finance over time. So maybe again we'll continue to break it down and understand that. So let's quickly kind of just, I'd be interested in both of your thoughts. From a corporate perspective and to the products that you've explained, what can they invest in today and how does it work? In very simple terms.
Sure, yeah. Can I ask the audience a question?
And after you answer my question, yeah.
Maybe in terms of that addressable market, right? And why would corporates be involved in this? Just a little test. Who here flies for work more than once a year? More than once a quarter? Once a week? How many of your organizations have purchased sustainable aviation fuel for your business travel? I'm not meaning to shame the other people, right? I'm just saying a lot of people here are flying. If you look at the amount of emissions that some very large organizations make, it's hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 every year just by business travel alone, right? There are over 10,000 organizations that have signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. Many of those validated, over 8,000. So there's a lot of companies flying. There's a lot of companies wanting to address their business travel emissions. And there is, I'd say, one of the few things that seem to be, that people seem to be in agreement about is that these certificates can be used towards your targets, right? So if you look at the different standards out there, there is consensus that this, what's called insetting, should be allowed to achieve targets. So there are many people that are potential buyers for this product. The addressable market is there, but I think they're going to need some things to be able to put those ambitions into action, which I'm sure we'll get to later.
Absolutely, thank you. Patrick?
Just to add to that, and back to your point, Maxime, about the standards, we've seen even relatively recently that the SBTI draft consultation that was recently published talks about SAF scope 3s as being a valid form of indirect mitigation. So we're seeing a clearer kind of regulatory landscape here. For those corporates who are interested in offsetting or compensating for their business travel emissions, of course they can do that in a variety of ways at the moment. There are various offsets and carbon reduction schemes and so on out there. The big advantage, just to come back to the insetting point, the big advantage of doing that with SAF Scope 3s is the emissions come from air travel, and the benefits, the mitigation with SAF Scope 3 is coming from air travel as well. So from a carbon accounting point of view, this is within the value chain. So it's not about a company generating emissions and then going and paying somebody else completely outside the value chain to compensate for that. It's staying within the value chain, which is a I think we could say a better form of mitigation than doing something completely outside the value chain. Just as an example, and I know SkyNRG has done many transactions like this as well, but as we announced a couple of months ago, a transaction with Microsoft where Microsoft decided that they wanted to source SAF Scope 3s to compensate for their business travel, and we brought those Scope 3s from, in this case, Cathay Pacific, the airline, and provided them to Microsoft. And that's the nature of the transaction for a very big corporate customer, but of course for much smaller corporate customers. I mentioned demand aggregation earlier on, and we, and I think probably SkyNRG also, can also facilitate those transactions for smaller quanta.
So clearly this is a SAF investor conference. So what kind of return would an investor expect for these products?
Well, I think we're not looking at it in the sense of a completely financial business case. This is about a company that recognizes their sustainability responsibilities, that wants to reduce their emissions, their net emissions, and is looking for the most, I'd say, most efficient, but also most compliant and demonstrably robust way of doing so. And that's essentially the equation, I think, that they're looking at.
Okay, so what's stopping more corporates then from joining this space today?
Yeah, I can add my own thoughts, but also actually within the, I don't know if people are familiar with the Sustainable Markets Initiative, but there's an aviation group in there as well. And we recently sent out a survey to a relatively small group of respondents, but asking this exact question. Obviously, budgets is one thing, right? Companies need not just the funding itself, the money, but also internal funding mechanisms to make sure that the budget comes from the right places within the company. But a very high priority for companies is the clarity on accounting and reporting from the GHG protocol, Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That is a very important factor for companies to decide. And why is that? Because ultimately, the companies are not very interested in buying SAF, right? They're interested in reducing their emissions. And so for them, the clarity and the surety that they can then account and report on those emissions reductions is obviously very important.
Yeah. One thing I'd add as well, and one of the reasons why companies are interested in buying SAF credits as opposed to something else, is especially for companies that rely heavily on aviation, whether it's for business travel, for transporting cargo or whatever else, by investing in SAF Scope 3 credits, they are effectively contributing to reduce the cost of SAF for the industry, for airlines as well. And that in turn allows for scaling up of the market faster. That's one of the things that drives us, because we see the importance of SAF production and use scale up if the industry is to hit its net zero targets. So the corporates that are buying the SAF credits are telling us effectively that not only are they able to compensate for their emissions, but they also see the strategic benefit in helping to accelerate the scale up of the industry.
Yeah, and I see it's interesting here that people want it, but they don't know how. And I think that's a common feedback that we've received today, that this is so new. It's supposed to be an enabler to scale decarbonisation, but we're not sure what it is. Is there enough guidance? And what are the detailed guidance in a standardized way to be able to do that? And that hits on one of the topics we'll talk about later in terms of taxonomy. But I just want to go back to the addressable market at the moment. So how big is it, and how big do we think it could be as we scale, particularly to 2050? Anyone want to take that?
It's really hard to put an exact number on this. The reason for that is we know what the travel emissions are, right, of large corporates. And I'm talking corporates here. Obviously, individual travelers can also buy this, right? So it's not just the corporates. We know the emissions. We know the targets. So we know, company X has 100,000 tons of CO2 emissions from business travel, and they want to get to net zero by 2030, whatever. The challenge is that corporates have many tools to achieve that. One is flying less. We've seen after COVID, some companies have made adjustments. There's less business travel for them. They've changed, their policies around when you can travel, how you can travel. The other is offsets, which again, if you're signed on to something like science-based targets, they don't have a role in that, but some companies may not, right? And so we need to sort of get an understanding of how big a role SAF certificates can play in that, and that's very hard to say. I'll also say, sorry, to kind of maybe reverse it, I think it's good to know for us as a community, right? Because we need to get an understanding of how far can this market grow with that voluntary demand. At the same time, I think it's important to kind of look at what can we do right now to get to that future state, whatever it is, because one good thing about the recent developments in the market is that there's been a number of registries being developed who have public retirement tables. And so we have a little bit more insight into the market. If you look at the retired credits on those registries, a lot of them are in the couple of hundreds, 150 to 500 tons per buyer, right? There's a lot of buying and selling going on outside of those registries still, so it's not a full picture, but it's relatively small amounts compared to the business travel volumes. And so, yes, that potential is out there, but let's also make sure, as we're seeing right now, that we can get the first transactions done by a larger group of companies than the 30 to 50 very active companies out there in the market right now. I think that's going to be key.
I think that's true. The other thing is that we're talking about SAF credits as mitigation for business travel, and that's an obvious way to go, what we'd call Scope 3, Category 6. But we're also seeing a number of corporates, an increasing number of corporates, especially in financial services, for example, aircraft lessors and others, who are looking at what they call invested carbon. In other words, the emissions intensity of their investment portfolio, and are looking at the potential to use SAF credits as a way of reducing that as well. So while business travel is a key driver for this, I think increasingly we'll see other applications for Scope 3 credits from corporates.
And clearly it's still evolving, and there are nuances, and there are there are 2 or 3 registries now that I actively, and it's continuing to evolve. There are nuances and challenges as well, and one of these is this whole subject of does this help fund additionality?
Yeah.
So I might just explore some of those for a few minutes, if I may.
Sure.
And one of the talking points at the moment is, should corporates be allowed to claim SAF credits even in mandated markets? And I'd like to hear both of your views on this, and really break down what the issue is and why this becomes important in the context of book and claim.
So just to kind of step back and explain that a little bit, because some of us are just deep in the rabbit hole of these markets. So the mandated markets are where the regulator has specified what percentage of fuel, for example, needs to be SAF. So we see that in the UK with the UK SAF blending mandate. We see that in the European Union, Refuel EU Aviation. And those are cases where the airlines or the fuel suppliers, in most cases, are the obligated parties. They have to upload a certain amount of SAF, irrespective of price, if you like. The other market is the voluntary market, where airlines are making voluntary commitments, as the name implies, to buy a certain percentage of SAF. The percentage they can buy is likely to depend on how much the SAF costs. Therefore, there's a very clear equation. If the price of that SAF can be lower, the airlines have the ability to buy more. And that's where what's known as additionality comes in. For example, if we can sell Scope 3 credits in respect of that SAF, or if the airline can sell them, because many airlines do, then that reduces the net cost of the SAF for the airline, and the airline can afford to buy more. And that's the case in the voluntary market. In the mandated market, as I say, it's not driven by what the airline wants to do, it's driven by regulation. So in our voluntary market, if a corporate buys some Scope 3s, that's money flowing in to reduce the net cost to the airline can go out and buy more. That's a good thing. In the mandated market, we don't sell Scope 3s in the mandated market. We don't believe that there's valid additionality there. That's our own view. If a corporate is buying, if somebody will sell a corporate Scope 3s from mandated fuel, that's not increasing the amount of fuel out there, the amount of SAF out there. It's not doing anything to hit the goal that we all have, which is reducing emissions. So I'd respectively say, and this is my personal view, that Scope 3s from the mandated market, actually that's nothing to do with sustainability. That's sustainability cosplay. So. Was I clear?
We probably need a PowerPoint to explain these things because they're so complex. But it is very much evolving, and I know from the Q&A here, it relates to that point specifically.
Yeah, sure.
Scope 3 pricing will enhance the bankability of ESAP projects or any type project.
We can certainly come back to that.
Yeah, so we might come back to that. Please.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, no, we discussed beforehand, like, let's try to keep it simple. Let's really create a good understanding of what this is. And actually, additionality is probably one of the most complex discussions in the industry right now, because we've looked at the carbon markets and kind of taken that concept of additionality into this market. And I think, Patrick, you already gave a really good introduction to how fuel can be mandated, and therefore you can ask yourself the question, is a company or a person buying credits over that fuel really generating sort of additional SAF, right? Mm-hmm. There is another area which is a group of buyers that only want to buy fuel when the carbon emissions would also not have been mandated. And that's a little bit more complex. So they also don't want to buy SAF that, for example, have been used by airlines towards CORSIA. Which I won't get into the technical details behind it, but I do think that is something that's sort of challenging us in terms of matching supply and demand, because obviously for airlines, avoiding carbon costs is a major motivator to buying SAF. So I would say that's one of the challenges in also creating a taxonomy and standardization, that there are simply different demands in the market. There are different flavors, and we need to be mindful of those differences in demand in how we shape and set up this market.
But if we come back to the subject, this is where people will say book and claim can be the Wild West. And while there's a bit of order coming to it, we could easily, without that clarification and guidance, get into double accounting or greenwashing. So I know that there's been great strides over the last year or two, and there is an order put in. I know we have a question from the audience that we'll come to in a second, but how or what can we do now, or how do you see that evolve, particularly as we run to 2030 mandates? If we take Europe, for example.
Yeah, I don't think that I think book and claim is a distribution mechanism. And the registries that Maxime has mentioned, so RSB registry, ISCC registry, the new IATA registry, are designed to be very robust to avoid double counting and to avoid double claiming. So I don't think I'd associate book and claim with that. It's more about if, for example, a company is buying scope 3s that don't actually bring additionality. So that's, if you like, on a perpendicular axis to what we're talking about with book and claim. And I think one of the important points in this context is we can certainly define different, if you like, different qualities of scope 3s, but I think as an industry we also have to be careful. We've seen what happened with the voluntary carbon market over the last few years, where people were trying to get maybe a little bit too smart at times, and that had an overall impact. And I think it's essential to achieve what we're all trying to achieve, i.e. reducing emissions, that we maintain the integrity of the SAF market.
And I think that's going to be the key enabler, right, to get credibility and to validation in the process. And that has come, but it's very new, relatively, and it is key, as you say, for the integrity of the process. We have a question, I think, from the floor. I don't know, is there any way we can get a mic right at the back, if that's okay? While they're getting you a mic, maybe I might just go to one of the questions here and then come back to you, if that's all right. So one of the questions come in here, I think, where do we think price discovery will settle on scope 3 certificates? Have we got a view on that, and also a magic wand and a crystal ball?
I'm just going to step out for a moment and dissect a chicken and look at its entrails, which I think is the best way we can judge that. We've seen a lot of movement around scope 3s. I'm sure you can comment on this as well. I mean, the prices have fluctuated a great deal as more supply has come on stream. So we haven't quite settled on that yet, but we are seeing, I think, a bit of stability on high quality scope 3s. That means with very clear additionality, with no gray area around that. And what we're actually seeing also from a number of corporates is they want to match their scope 3 purchases with where their emissions occur. So they may say 50% of our emissions last year were in North America, therefore we want 50% of our scope 3s to be from North America, this percentage was from Asia, and so on. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I don't know where it's going to settle. I hope there's a little bit of stability coming into the market, but I think that we're not out of the woods yet.
Okay. Do you want to add anything to
not naming specific prices because obviously for obvious reasons, but I would agree that it's not stable yet. And to be fair, I think within this year we'll see some further movements because obviously a lot of producers have been gearing up towards mandates. Mm-hmm. So there might be fuel in the market right now that's being supplied to the voluntary market that might not be available, in the next years as they are redirected towards mandate. So I think this is a hard one to
It is, and
right
I'm
now.
going to push you a little bit more. So when do you think it would settle, given where we are? Obviously, Europe has a mandate. Mm-hmm. Some jurisdictions don't. So how long do you think before there is a informed guesstimate for that pricing, or at least stability?
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I think as the mandates are ramping up and supply is ramping up, we're always going to see this adjustment every year, right? So if you would want price stability as a corporate or as a Scope 3 buyer, I would recommend locking that in now for a longer term, because you will simply be subject to whatever the market is doing each year, right, if you don't. So, when can we get stability? Well, maybe when you decide you want that.
And I'd add, when can we get stability in, just to pick a random example, US environmental policy? Then maybe after that, day after that,
I think it's probably more than a crystal ball we'll need, but okay. I know we have a question at the back here. Sorry. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. There's no way I could have typed this in and have you read it from the front there. Gaynor Hartnell, RTFA. A lot's made of the ability for SAF to reduce the non-CO2 global warming impacts because of the lower aromatic content of the fuel. And I've heard airlines talking about, preferentially using SAF for certain flights where damaging contrail formation is predicted and stuff. And is it a contradiction to have book and claim and that? I mean, are airlines kind of having their cake and eating it here? Or is it that you can both have a kind of book and claim, accounting amount of SAF in the fuel and know exactly what molecules there are, like in the wing as well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of elements to that question, and we might break it down. I mean, obviously the subject of contrails and has a number of variables associated from an airline's perspective. But what I would say is it's a combination of all of these things that can be a net positive to decarbonisation. Where you fly, how you fly, what altitude you fly, if we just take contrails, for example, are all obviously important factors to the equation. But I think there are other elements associated with whether that will become a stabilized mechanism for book and claim. I think it will in time, but I think they're also in a state of evolution, and the market needs to things. So that would be my view on it.
Absolutely, and I'd politely push back on the airlines having their cake and eating it, because the state of science on contrails is evolving very fast. I think it's going to be clear that there will be cases where it's better to have higher percentages of SAF blends on some particular routes. We're not at that yet, and when we're talking about the carbon markets here, that isn't reflecting the non-CO2 effect. So I can see an absolute role for policy in the future to, let's say, designate that SAF should be uplifted in particular airports. That actually doesn't influence shouldn't influence where the environmental attributes for that SAF are being sold. This is about making sure the physical molecules are uplifted in a particular place, and in fact, book and claim can facilitate that rather than the contrary.
Do you want to add on it? You don't have to. That's fine. Thank you for the question. We have another one here that we'll take. So why is SAF cheaper in the voluntary market than the mandatory market? You're going to earn your lunch today.
Okay, well, I'm going to sell you something that you have to buy from me. How much price flexibility do you have to negotiate that? You absolutely need this thing I'm selling you. And that's the mandatory market at the moment. We're hearing from airline after airline, and you probably are as well, that, to put it politely, their fuel suppliers, again, this is, let's say, the EU mandatory market, that their fuel suppliers are adding all manner of surcharges and levies and fees and pushing up the price because they can. Whereas in the voluntary market, a clue in the word voluntary, the airlines don't actually have to buy this. They'll buy it if the price is reasonable.
might be preaching to the choir, but this is also exactly why the voluntary market is so important right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because airlines are subject to many different compliance mechanisms right now. Some of the effects are still being settled, and for financiers, for airlines, it's therefore very important to have that voluntary demand, not just for now, but for a longer term. So yeah, it's something we've heard about. I don't have insight, obviously, into those contracts and dynamics, but yeah, apparently there is some of this going on.
Okay, so bringing it back to if I'm a mature SAF buyer, how do we help from an investor perspective? How do we help them de-risk long-term deals then in the context of book and claim, particularly as we want this market to grow on corporates? Any ideas of what we can do now, or what are the potential levers to allow this to get a bit more order and a bit more structure as it's evolving?
I think, as Maxime said a moment ago, I think looking at multi-year contracts, that's very helpful, because equally, airlines can think about multi-year SAF contracts, but corporates can also think about multi-year commitments for Scope 3s, and having some kind of longer-term visibility is really important from a project finance point of view and from a market scaling point of view, because seeing that demand, or seeing those demand signals, that's really fundamental for fueling the, no pun intended, the growth of the market.
And I see there's an interesting question came through, because I know you're transacting on a lot of these today, but have you seen any greenwashing accusations regarding companies claiming SAF? I'm not asking you to name or shame, but I'm just saying.
No, but I think we could, I'd keep people back from their lunch. We could certainly talk about that, but I think probably on balance we'd prefer lunch. But what I would say is the greenwashing, which is a very big topic, it's not necessarily what the companies are doing, it's how they're claiming it and whether they're putting a context on it. And we see this equally in the airline space. Some companies may be accused of greenwashing because they've taken some environmental initiative, but they're not quite putting it in context, and therefore it's appearing bigger or more consequential than it actually is. So where companies are accurately explaining what they're doing, we have this many emissions, we are compensating in the following way, we recognize that we have this many emissions, we're trying to reduce them as well by flying less on business and so on. That is, I think, best practice in this case, and I haven't seen any greenwashing issues with that, because that's simply pragmatism.
Can I add something to the previous question still? Okay. Because obviously long-term offtakes are going to be incredibly helpful, right? Not everyone might be there yet. I would imagine most companies want to go through a couple of transactions to kind of understand how it works before they go into that. There was a GBTA survey sent out last year with quite a high number of respondents, and over 50% of the respondents said they didn't know yet how many or what level of SAF certificate purchases they would be doing in 2030. The SMI survey that I referred to earlier, there were twice as many people saying they had an internal SAF target versus those that said they had an external SAF target. So if a long-term transaction commitment is not something you're ready for yet, I would say at the minimum how this market could be supported is creating an internal ambition, then translating that to something you could share externally, setting a target or a plan that is for the longer term, so that the market can get a better understanding of what is that level of demand, how many people are willing to buy at what price. I think would already be very helpful, as also as a company developing these production plans. Will be very helpful in creating that path onwards.
And like many of the elements we described today, taxonomy also plays a part in this and is starting to standardize, and there are still work in progress in terms of terminology and mechanisms, and there are philosophical differences on additionality that we spoke about. Are there any particular barriers or things that we can get in terms of quick wins on taxonomy, or have you got a view on when we think that will also standardize and make life simpler for this process?
I suppose in terms of corporates who are looking at this and how they make sure they're buying the right kind of credits, if you like, there's a couple of layers. First of all of the Scope 3 credits that typically are being sold for SAF they have sustainability certification from RSB or ISCC or one of those bodies. So that's already a demonstration of sustainability quality. Secondly, the nature of the market at the moment is, and the nature of the accounting that companies need to do, they're looking for guidance on that. So we've had recently the SBTI draft consultation indicating that this is reasonable. I think back to your question, what will make a big difference as well will be when GHG Protocol publishes standards on this. But I think that's the direction we're going in.
Clearly, this is a complex area and is evolving as we run. I'm conscious that we've just run over, and I want everyone to run for lunch. So I'll maybe leave last thoughts to the panelists. And again, thank you for your time. Hopefully, that gave you some insights into the book and claim evolution. But obviously, it's also a clear enabler, particularly as the products scale on the journey to decarbonisation. So if you have any last comments or questions on this, we'll wrap it up.
Maybe for those out there that have purchased these soft certificates, just an encouragement to share about your experience, because we've seen that the quickest way for people to ramp up in this market is to learn from their peers. So really just go out there, ask your peers, what are you doing? How can I have my business case experience and purchase experience help you in also going through this process?
Yeah, I'd absolutely second that. This is a relatively straightforward and painless experience for corporates. It's just they may not have done it before. So that's very worthwhile. I'll come back very quickly to one of the questions that just disappeared off the screen, which was, can Scope 3 sales enhance the bankability of e-fuels projects? That's really one we should discuss in the bar later on, because I think alcohol is going to be needed for it. But I think in general, I'd say that Scope 3 sales can enhance the bankability of any SAF projects of any nature. Because it's generating another revenue stream. We could talk about e-fuels at greater length, but lunch beckons, and I think the e-fuel economics at the moment are very much geared towards a mandatory market rather than necessarily a voluntary market. But again, that's one we can talk about again. But just to echo what Maxime has said, I think there's huge scope for corporates to drive the not merely book and claim, but to drive the uptake in the SAF market. But it means not being shy about doing it, but actually communicating that, yes, this is what we're doing because we believe it's the right thing to do.
That's great. I think on that note, we'll break. Thank you, Patrick and Maxime, for your time. Thank you. I think lunch is served.